The Center for Procurement Excellence is a nonprofit member organization with a mission of educating, promoting, and advocating for better RFP processes. Join CPE today and make your RFPs faster and more transparent. Membership also includes discounts to all of our training and networking events. CPE hosts a variety of virtual and in-person networking and training events throughout the year. Visit our website to get signed up. CPE Speakers Bureau is available for your regional and national meetings and professional conferences. Contact us to learn more.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
It's time to get into our topic here. What are the best evaluation criteria, best in quotation marks? We will have to define that. Basically, we wanted to take a look at a research study that has been completed on this topic. So a little bit of science mixing into procurement here. How fun is that? Here's our agenda. We'll go through a quick definition up front of what it even means to be a good or solid or quote unquote best evaluation criteria. And then we'll run through the study together, go through the method of how it was done, some of the results of it, and we'll close out with a quick discussion of implications of what the study is revealing. But start it up as promised, let's look at best evaluation criteria. What does that even mean? It can mean a lot of things. We're going to boil this down and overly simplify it here into two primary items. Number one is speed. So when it comes to speed, what we mean is that you as the client or buyer organization and your evaluation teams are able to quickly review all of the material that came back in the vendor proposal. So there is an emphasis there on all. If it's something you're asking for and not really using it or reviewing it, then you should be questioning, why are we even asking for this upfront in the first place? Is there another time or place that we can get that type of information? So keep that in mind. So speed is one. Number two, we'll get to that in a moment, but first I want to go through a quick example of speed. Some of you have seen this before in our RFP class where we cover it, but it's a picture that's worth 1,000 words. This is a real picture of a hard copy requirements for a proposal related to a large technology project. The backstory on this, for those who haven't seen this slide before, was that we are helping an organization, some of us on the RFP Doctor folks at Simplo were helping an organization with a large IT project. And this is what they described as their background of their last RFP for large software services. Is there was a call made to the procurement agents saying, hey, we got a package for you, a pallet for you, rather, down in shipping. And procurement says, well, what the heck do you mean that we got a pallet? It was proposals, because they had required 15 hard copy proposals and asked for the world of content. So each box there was actually a proposal. So that's obviously not fun to evaluate. A lot of paperwork to snooze through. It is not going to be a speedy evaluation process. So when it comes to speed, remember the goal sometimes is that less is more in terms of what we're asking for in proposal contents. Really what we want to be asking ourselves is, what's the minimum amount of information that we need to collect so that we can make an informed evaluation decision and be able to justify it and stand by it and figure out which vendor, software solution, et cetera, are we going to invite forward as the best proposal for our needs. So ideally, we don't want any more pages than is necessary to figure out who's the best offerer amongst the competing field. So that's speed, ability to quickly review all the materials. That's one definition of what's a good, solid evaluation criterion. Number two is differentiation. We're going to define that as the ability of that criterion to clearly justify or separate which material and therefore which proposal and vendor is getting a better or worse score. If we score everything the same, we don't see any differences between the vendors, then we've wasted our time and we didn't get anywhere further down the road towards an evaluation judgment. So quickly, as an example of what that means, I'm going to run through a scenario. And for the purposes of this illustration, I just want you to imagine a simple evaluation scale, like a 1 through 10 scale, not recommending necessarily that you use a 1 through 10 evaluation scale. This is just for the purposes of illustration. We're going to draw out a mathematical point from this here momentarily. So imagine you're using just a simple 1 through 10 evaluation scale, 10 being a good, solid proposal, 1 being scary, never want to work with them, and everywhere in between. So just keep it simple like that. And let's imagine that we've received 3 proposals for whatever our project happens to be. So again, not recommending 1 through 10 necessarily. This is just purposes of illustration. Let's say you've got 2 different evaluation criteria that you're using, number 1 and number 2. And on number 1, let's say that on average across those 3 proposals, you get a 9.1 out of 10 score, a 9.0, and a 9.2. In other words, no real difference. Whereas the other item, maybe you have a 3 out of 10, a 6 or 6.7 out of 10, 9.2 out of 10. Not saying you are going to use the decimal system in your 1 through 10 scale. This might be the average across your evaluation committee members, hence the need for decimals there, just an average. So when you look at those 2, which one is more helpful for you in picking the right or best vendor? Obviously, the criteria that's giving you a range. Whereas criteria number 1 there, 9.1, 9.0, 9.2, there's really no mathematical difference there, right? So when it comes to which criterion was best, well, if our goal up front is to pick the best proposal, the best vendor, the best product, the best offering, then you're hoping to see a bit of a range so you can actually identify and look and say, this one was better than the others. So one of the things that is a useful teaching point that most of you know quite well is if you have a criteria like the one over on the left here, where you're getting scores that are super, super close, that's probably not something that really needs to be evaluated by your evaluation team. It's maybe something that can be more of a pass-fail. If you want to check that that is there, that might be fine, but it's really not serving any functional evaluation purpose to help you separate the best from the rest. Whereas on the right-hand side, criteria number 2, you're seeing a range here, and that's more of a quality or qualifications or functional type of scoring. So that's all we mean by differentiation, is you're actually able to see a range amongst the competitors. Another quick example some of you have seen before, but I think it illustrates the point quite well. Some of you are aware of this case where we are helping with a $1 billion data center procurements. That particular client, Fortune 100 sized firm or larger, had 12 to 15, actually 15 as shown here, different evaluation criteria that they wanted to use, and that's already too much. And so I'm going to show you just what happened with their 1, which was the safety plan. They received 6 proposals in response to this RFP. In this case, it's contractors to build out that big $1 billion data center. And across those 6 proposals, they averaged 356 pages just for the safety plan submission itself, which of course is not a speedy thing to evaluate. The evaluation team actually spent 2.5 weeks just looking at this one set of responses for the safety plan. And then in the end, the variance in those scores that came back from the committee was 1.5%. In other words, there was really no difference in the scores. They scored them all the same. So to bring that back to the last example on differentiation, that's mathematically equivalent to seeing a 9.1 out of 10 versus 9.0 out of 10 versus a 9.2 out of 10. If you think about it, 0.1, decimal scale here out of a 10-point scale is about 1% or 2 total variance. So almost nothing, mathematically nothing. So keep that definition in mind in terms of variance, because that's something we're going to look at. I know it's a scary mathematical term, perhaps, the statistics, but that's the true measure of, are we seeing differentiation amongst the proposals per criteria? And why this matters so much too, to not waste the time of your evaluators, their precious time, is that the way that most RFP evaluation processes will work is you get a written response, whether you're collecting it in hard copy or electronically, irrelevant, but you get some type of proposal response back from the vendor community. You evaluate that and you use it to do some type of a short list oftentimes prior to interviews or demos, unless you only have a few proposals. Well, if your upfront criteria here don't have much variance, then there's really no functional shortlist. You're saying, hey, they're all the same. Maybe the only thing that you're going to shortlist off of then might be price, in which case now you're reverting yourself a little bit towards low bid functionally in your evaluation steps. So watch out for that. Why use an RFP if you're going to go that way? So this matters because sometimes you'll have your evaluation teams scoring things the same, not wanting to take a stand on if they're seeing differences and whatnot, and maybe they can't tell differences between the proposal contents. Well, that actually is a waste of time. So that brings us to our study. Now that we've drawn out the points of speed, number 1, and number 2, You're trying to accomplish differentiation. We're trying to identify and select the best vendor and proposal offering for our specific need. So here's our study that we had accomplished. Some of you know that myself, Jake, many of us here on the RFP Doctor team, we are academic research nerds. So we do have to do some research for our day-to-day professor gigs. And so we're happy to bring one of those studies to you that we think is applicable to the real world versus all those other studies that we just make up. Kidding, of course. All right. 1,800 proposals were collected across nearly 350 projects. So what that means is there was on average about 5.5 proposals per project. So pretty typical probably to what you see for most RFPs. These were all RFPs. We did track the evaluation committee scores for every single proposal across every single evaluation criteria in those 1,850 proposals. So in other words, we grabbed a bunch of projects with a bunch of proposals and tracked all of the evaluation scores, because then we could do some nerdy math around it. And what I'm going to share with you here is what we focused on some of the major evaluation criteria, the things that were pretty common across the whole data set, despite the fact that there are, of course, different types of projects built into the 347 projects in this data set. So the big four that we focused on were evaluation criteria that measured past performance of the proposing firms. Then evaluation criteria related to project approach, project management plans, risk assessments, innovative ideas, those types of things were built into the project approach. Interviews, and of course the cost proposals. Those are the big four. Obviously there are more criteria you can use than those, but these are pretty common ones that stretch across all 347 of these projects. The other thing I'll mention, in terms of how do we actually get access to all of these proposals and every single evaluation committee score, this is some of the work that our group does. Those of us who are on the Simplar side, if you don't know what that is, we're a group of researchers, consultants, org change managers, and trainers. We help organizations implement advanced procurement tools, among other things. So we run a lot of projects. Our overall idea of helping client organizations become a client of choice in partnering with their vendor community is typically a strategic objective that we're helping folks accomplish. We run projects of all different types. And if you want to learn more about the specific procurement approaches that we tend to use there, you can go back to an RFP Doctor recording from last January, the 20th of 2022. The title is "It's a New Year. Are you ready for the next level?" And one of the Simplar folks went through about an hour of different content on what that process looks like. So that is the context for this study and how we actually were able to get access to all the proposals, because these were proposals that we actually helped procure. So there's some detail behind it. It goes through the whole approach. That's all there. So I just want to make sure you're aware of that and briefly define what those variables were. And that's how we got access to them. So past performance, there were different ways that this was measured, but by and large, this was done in a survey, numerical survey-based fashion, where we were collecting somewhere between 9 and 25 surveys of prior customer satisfaction with the vendor and their team and their products. So again, that's covered in greater detail in the video that's up there on the right-hand part of your screen. The project approach piece, those of you who had attended that session may remember what we tend to do on the Simplar advanced procurement side is have a very restrictive page limit, typically somewhere between 2 to 6 pages in total, where we're looking at the vendor's capability to identify, prioritize, and minimize risk, and also come forward with other alternatives, options, and innovative ideas. And the other some unique things there is that these are blind and anonymous. So that's kind of a cool thing for the study, is that the evaluation scores have no bias related to vendor name, brands, type, things like that. It's all purely based upon the quality of the content included in the project approach documents, which adds to a little bit more validity to the study if you're thinking about it from that point of view. The interview approach that we used, also very structured and restrictive, where we're interviewing actual assigned members of the vendor's project teams, not executives, not business development, not marketing folks. Some of you have seen this process before. That's all in there too. So pretty robust interview structure included in these variables too. And then cost, of course, is submitted as a dollar value, depending upon what the structure is. Most are probably lump sum fixed price. There's some guaranteed maximum prices in there, some level of effort estimates and hourly rates for consulting services. but that's all in there too. So just wanted to define those because these are going to be the 4 primary evaluation criteria that we're going to review and show you the results of the study. So here's the results. Again, the reminder, if you go back to that prior example of the 1.5% variance, which is basically equivalent to no difference on a 1 through 10 scale, 9.1, 9.0, 9.2. That's kind of the setup we're going to look at. So here's the graph I want you to be familiar with. If you think of the average evaluation score across the competing pool of proposal contents, well, that criterion 1, I know it's kind of small there, that had a score of 9.1 versus 9.0 versus a 9.2 across the 3 competing proposals in our make-believe scenario. What that is it's a variance of only 1 to 2% between top to bottom. Not a very big variance, not helpful in differentiating what the best proposal is. Whereas that other example, criterion 2, that had a 1 through 10 score of 3.1 versus 6.7 versus 9.2, if you actually do the math on it, that's a variance of about 39%. Really helps you differentiate, right? So that's kind of the definition of our variance variable that we're going to use in this study. So I'm going to go back to these 4 key items here for our major criteria, and we're going to show you the results using the same type of graph and the same measure of variance. Very low, any criteria related to past performance of vendors, their teams, their firms, their products was pretty similar to that 9.0 versus 9.1 versus 9.2 criterion that we covered. Only a 2% variance across those 1,850 proposals. So minor. More of a pass-fail type of thing where we're asking ourselves, hey, do those vendors have the past experience to be a solid offering here? But once they do, it's hard to really differentiate between, well, how much better is the best? Next up was cost. It's about a 5 to 9%, plus or minus 5% range. So costs can be pretty tight. There is some difference in the data depending upon how well defined your scope is. We could talk about that separately. But cost actually is pretty tight across good competitive proposals. Project approach, however, much bigger variance. And then interviews with the project team individuals done well there. Also high variance. So that's the results of all the effort to run almost 350 procurements and keep track of all the proposals, all of the evaluation scores. It can all be boiled down to this one slide, that across the major evaluation criteria categories shown here, these big 4, your project approach, which is a future-looking written type of document submission in the proposals, and the interviews themselves, much higher variance that you can see across the scoring than these other items. So what are some discussion points and quick implications here? Well, number 1 is that speed and differentiation can in fact be achieved in just a few criteria and minimal page count. So we mentioned that there's some page count limits on those criteria that were used in the study, yet also still high differentiation, mathematically speaking, for the project approach and then the interviews as well. Another thought is the type of criteria that all get scored about the same. Why don't we remove that from the burden of having to score it, maybe make these pass or fail requirements, or maybe even eliminate them entirely. Have to be careful to keep your procurement process open and not have too many burdensome minimum quals that can exclude competition. Of course, your greater weight in your evaluation process, you should put more weight towards criteria that are actually going to help you differentiate amongst the competitors. And yes, we do like forms or checkboxes and templates in the proposal process as well. That is a best practice that helps you keep things consistent and evaluate in a non-biased way. Of course, there's a ton of other evaluation criteria out there that you can use. I've listed 24 of them here, so it's just copied from an RFP. And something that we have to consider is, why do our internal clients, our project teams, our business units, our agencies, why do they ask for so much stuff if left to their own devices in an RFP? Usually it's for good reasons, right? Usually it's because they've seen an RFP and we've asked for a bunch of stuff in the past, but that's just their guess because they're not procurement experts, or they've been burned in the past and they don't want to make those same mistakes. And so one of the other takeaways from this study is that there are criteria that are better at differentiating than others, and it can be done with minimal page count, and we don't have to ask for the world. So when you're looking at an RFP, and many of you are familiar with CPE's recommended RFP structure, this 1 through 7 sections of the RFP listed on the screen, the key for us as procurement professionals is this. When developing an RFP, we want to keep that internal project team, that agency, that business group, that department, whoever those folks are, and whatever terminology you use in your organization, the owner of that project, we want to keep their focus 99% on developing the project statement of work, scope, requirements, current conditions, current states. Keep them focused on documenting that, and keep them out of trying to dictate what's going to be a good evaluation criteria. Chances are they are not procurement experts and may not have that much experience with RFPs, whereas you in the procurement professional world know a lot better, and now you're armed with this study to show which criteria are going to mathematically achieve better differentiation. That's your job to help coach those project teams to a good, solid RFP structure and set of criterion. So keep them focused on documenting their scope. Keep them away from the evaluation criteria. You're the procurement professional. You know best how to do that. Of course, you're going to get their input. I'm not saying to be a dictator, but in terms of effort allocation, this is something to try to help your project teams understand upfront. The other reminder too, and we use this slide all the time, but from a vendor's point of view, times are still busy out there. There are many fish in the sea, so to speak, lots of RFP opportunities, and we want to get the best possible competition for ours. We want the vendors to look at us and see the prettiest fish in the sea. They're going to put together a proposal response for us. That's what we want. And the more burdensome we make things, then the less likely they are to propose. Jake and I were both on a software project procurement that we were assisting a city with earlier this morning. And one of the vendors that we were interviewing said, hey, if you make the RFP burdensome, you make us respond to 1,000 line item requirements for the software projects, we're probably just not going to respond. In fact, there were 3 RFPs that we saw last week that were good fits for us, and we just chose not to respond because it just takes too much effort. So you have to keep that in mind, that the vendors are busy, and the first thing they're going to size up from your RFP beyond whether it's a good fit for them in terms of scope is they're going to say, how much work is it to put together a response to this RFP? If it's too much work, they're just going to punt on it, not even going to worry about it, which then means if you want to keep it low work, yet you still need to be able to differentiate in a justifiable fashion, that brings you back to this study and focusing the limited space that you have for evaluation criteria to focus it on criteria that are truly going to help you differentiate and still come away with a solid evaluation decision. So that's the discussion and implications of the study. Hopefully that is helpful to you all. One other thought I was going to offer to you is happy 420. And those of you who live in states with a Chiba Hut, please do enjoy a Chiba Hut sandwich on 420 if you can. Look at how delicious that looks. Good sandwich with all the works. So happy Thursday and happy 420 to you all from the bottom of our hearts here at CPE. And with that, happy to take questions or just open things up to discussion. Jake, what do you say with 85 folks, how you want to handle that?
Well, a couple of things there. I do have a breakout room set up, Brian, so I think we should actually do that here. But before we do that, I thought Margaret had a really good question. And the question is, how do you deal with pass or fail, and how many points to that? I'll kind of offer my 2 cents to that. By definition, the nature of a pass or fail thing means that if somebody can't meet those requirements, therefore they don't meet the requirements. And if it's a pass or fail type thing, then by definition, they shouldn't be able to go forward here. Now, the follow-on to that, though, is to be really careful about what those pass-fail requirements are and really ask ourselves, is something truly, if you don't have it, you're not responsive type deal? And so we would tend to prefer to take some of those out as pass or fail, just minimum requirements, and instead focus on what's their plan to actually get the work done here. Great question, Margaret. Got another question from Stefan. Do you have certain criteria specifically for ERPs that would work best? Brian's kind of our IT guru here, and Brian does have recommendations for both those project types. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Are you
sorry,
able
I
to
was
chat
just
about that?
yeah, just responding there. Yes, criteria there, and also kind of the strategy of how you approach those project types is a big deal. I don't want to bog down our discussion here, but the shorthand of it is you don't need to ask for the worlds. In fact, the software type that Jake and I were looking at this morning and got that feedback from the vendor of, hey, if you ask me for too much, I'm just not going to propose. That was an asset management system, which is kind of the closest enterprise related software solution, just like one step down from going to full ERP. And many of those companies actually provide both asset management and ERP solutions. So absolutely take that feedback from the vendor community as being applicable to your ERP procurement for sure. But yeah, got to keep it streamlined. The other thing that to recommend to you there is to recognize the market reality in the ERP or other enterprise software segments that you're likely looking at separate companies who provide the software solution versus the system integration or system implementation services. Those are different companies. You're likely to sign two separate contracts in the end. And there's a lot of nuance in how to discuss the strategy of that. Most folks tend to focus on the software solution because they think that's what I'm going to live with for the next decade. It's not often that you go through an ERP procurement. It's a big one. It's hairy. It's scary. It has a lot of implications for virtually everyone across the organization. So it's something you don't want to do more than once a decade. Usually it means something has gone horribly wrong if you're re-procuring it again quickly. So most folks will focus on the software side saying, hey, that's what we're going to live with. When the reality is the ability to achieve full functionality of that software is completely dependent upon the system implementer team who deploys it for you. So those are two separate categories of the evaluation: how to look at the software versus the system integrator team. We have a more unique approach on how we tackle that, of separating that into different solicitations. But that's my short answer to you is, yeah, keep it streamlined. It matters a lot there. The feedback about going overly burdensome directly applies to enterprise level software, and happy to chat about that further.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.